Hello, my name is Michaela Marks, and my presentation is called The Mothers and Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, a Movement. My presentation is about the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo and the way that their all-women human rights movement made way for women in Argentina to come out of their traditional roles as domestic caretakers and into new roles as political activists. So a little bit of background on this subject. A military coup overthrew President Isabel Perón in 1976 and established a dictatorship in its place. Referred to as the Dirty War, the dictatorship saw the disappearances of almost 30,000 people, extreme human rights violations, and atrocities never experienced before. The government was identifying people not only associated with insurgency, but also the people associated with the activists that were against the dictatorship. This meant that people, even in the address book of activists, were seen as a threat to the military dictatorship and were often captured as well. In order to instill fear into the lives of the citizens, the government employed the Night and Fog Decree that was created by Adolf Hitler during the Nazi regime. This involved the act of disappearing people in anonymity at all hours of the day. People would be taken by unrecognizable officials and vehicles due to the lack of uniforms worn by the officials and the lack of license plates on the Ford Falcons, which were the cars that they often used. Many witnesses reported that these abductions were violent and forceful on the hands of the officials seizing the people. The victims that disappeared were often captured, tortured, and murdered, their bodies then disposed of by methods like the death flights, which were when the government drugged the victims, flew them out to sea, and threw their bodies into the water of the Atlantic Ocean. The dictatorship used this tactic to keep the people fearful and less willing to rebel against them. Despite rules and laws meant to keep people from gathering and meeting, the mothers' committees began to immobilize. Soon after, the grandmothers of the children that were taken from the disappeared also joined the movement in an effort to look for the nearly 500 kids that were taken from their parents when they were captured. They began meeting on April 30th, 1977, and continue to meet today. So before this movement, the women were traditional housewives with no previous political experience. Stepping out into the public sphere was met by challenges and the questioning of traditional roles held by women in general. In Argentina at this time, machismo was a powerful social phenomenon that maintained that a woman's traditional place was at home with the children. The kidnappings invaded the home domain and assaulted these women's roles as protectors within the home. This allowed the women to politicize the role of being a mother and reframed motherhood as an active, public, and political role. In order to break out of the private sphere and into the public, required the women to get their voices heard. They started meeting in the Plaza de Mayo every Thursday at 3:30 in order to march in front of the government building and protest the disappearances of their children. The use of this public space was extremely important to their mission to gain notoriety on both the national and international level. And despite efforts by the government to prevent the public protests, the women always found a way to be heard. The government tried to prevent them from gathering in a public space by instilling laws against unauthorized standing and gathering of more than 3 people. And as a response, the mothers obeyed the commands and began marching in pairs around the circular plaza. Despite government efforts to arrest and attack them, they would avoid it. They would change the date of their marches at the last minute, join religious processions, and talk to people about their cause. And when the police arrested one of their members during a march, 60 mothers would come into the police station shouting, "If you take one, you have to take us all." One of the symbols that they use, along with the Plaza de Mayo as a public space to get their voices heard, was the white head kerchief. It has even been painted on the ground in the plaza as a representation of the mothers and grandmothers that have met there the past 40 years. So, transforming the traditional role of motherhood. The mothers managed to transform the traditional role of motherhood into a political agency by using traditional values such as the preservation of the lives of their children in order to protest. The radical motherhood that they came to be identified with was a way to advance progressive values of gender roles while also still being able to identify themselves as caretakers of their children. The women of this movement were able to get away with certain actions that would not have been possible if it was a mixed gender movement due to traditional norms at the time. The mothers' resistance to the oppressive state dictatorship had to emerge within sanctioned roles. If the fathers had been allowed to participate, there would have been a lot more violence associated with the movement, and the likelihood of far more disappearances. The use of motherhood as an agent in order to draw support for their human rights movement. They identified themselves as a collective, claiming that they have socialized maternity, meaning the disappeared children of one is the child of all the mothers. And by socializing maternity, it makes the movement relevant to all mothers, regardless of whether their children have been found or not, and no matter the status of their child. The mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo also gained gender consciousness from this movement. The grandmothers created a new form of political participation outside the traditional party structures based on the values of love, caring, and motherhood, which allowed them to build a bond and shape a movement without men. Had men been allowed to join the movement, they wouldn't have been able to use these three methods to fully exercise their roles as mothers. It would have been difficult for men at this time to be identified with those three traits due to the view of men being tough and the head of the household. They would not have been able to identify with the emotional values or just emotions in general, like women, were socially accepted to perform and to act. So the legacy. Despite the dangers of meeting, the women believed in their mission of getting their children back and bringing the horrors of the military dictatorship to public attention. They suffered through verbal harassment, death threats, and violence, often from the government, and they have even traced back these threats to the presidents during this period themselves. However, the women continue to meet and advocate for human rights today. They were able to transform their grief as mothers losing their children, into this political activism that started the movement and allowed them to protest the human rights violations that were occurring at this time. As of March 8th, 128 grandchildren have been identified with the help of DNA matching. However, the women will not rest until all of the people that were disappeared during this time period have been accounted for. The mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo believe that it is their duty to keep the memory alive and to never forget the horrors of the military dictatorship and to advocate for human rights everywhere. So the conclusion of my presentation is that by being housewives with no previous political experience, the women of the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo were able to use their agency as mothers to transform the political landscape of Argentina at the time of the military dictatorship. This meant that they were able to use the traditional values of mothers, of caring for their children, in order to serve a greater purpose. That was the bringing light to the human rights violations that were occurring during this time. This is my works cited, and thank you.